This is NPR.
The events in and around Boston this past week leave the country stunned. So many unanswered questions, so many still wondering why. I'm Jackie Leighton. The latest on the Boston Marathon bombings, the men suspected of carrying out the attack, and the rest of the day's news. Next time on All Things Considered from NPR News.
We thank you for tuning in to WETS-FM and WETS-HD1 in Johnson City, listener-supported public radio. That's a partnership between East Tennessee State University and listeners like you. It's 7:30. Community Forum is next.
And welcome to WETS Community Forum for Saturday, April 20th, 2013, and for Sunday, April 21st. I'm Wayne Winkler. The events in Boston this past week have shocked the United States and indeed the entire world. It's a story that's still unfolding. I'm recording this segment at just about 12 noon on Friday, and as I speak, police are still searching for one suspect. One suspect has been killed. The story is still developing and was still developing on Wednesday night when I spoke with Joseph Fitsanakis. Joseph Fitsanakis coordinates the Security and Intelligence Studies program at King University in Bristol, Tennessee. He's authored several books and articles on the history and politics of intelligence and international espionage. His work has been referenced in hundreds of outlets around the world, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, BBC, ABC, the Boston Herald, Politico, Al Jazeera, the Huffington Post, and Studies in Intelligence, the Journal of the Central Intelligence Agency. He's the senior editor of Intel News and a regular contributor to specialized publications such as Embassy, The Diplomat, Foreign Policy Journal, Homeland Security Today, The Intelligencer, and others. His research interests lie in the areas of international espionage, domestic security and surveillance, and the history and practice of intelligence, with particular reference to the CIA and National Security Agency. This week we've heard the term terrorism tossed around quite a bit from the president, from the news media, and from just about everybody talking about what has happened this week. Let's get a definition of what is terrorism.
You know, there's a lot of definitions of terrorism, and it's actually very important in times like this to be as precise as possible. The best one I've come across, and I think the one I rely on the most, is that terrorism is the calculated and organized use or threat of indiscriminate violence to attain some kind of broad political or ideological objective. And if you think about this, all of the terms that I just mentioned are critical and all have to be there for it to be terrorism. For example, it has to be calculated and organized. It has to be indiscriminate. In other words, if you only target uniformed personnel, that is not terrorism. You have to target civilians. You have to not care who dies or who gets hurt. And you have to have some kind of broad political or ideological motive for doing this type of attack. So, for instance, there's a reason why we don't call school shootings terrorism. Going to a school and shooting children because you're deranged does not make you a terrorist. So it has to be very specific, and that's the reason why I'm cautioning people in regards to this particular attack, the attack in the Boston Marathon, not to necessarily jump to conclusions. If it turns out it was some kind of deranged person that wants attention for attention's sake, it makes it a horrible crime. It does not necessarily make it terrorism.
Now, as we're speaking on Wednesday evening, we don't know who committed this act. We don't have any suspects in custody yet, so it's impossible to say who was behind this or who is even a suspect. But at this time, what can you say about the explosions at the Boston Marathon based on the information that has been available to all of us through the news media?
A lot of people have tried to look at the technical specifications of the bombing in order to draw some kind of general conclusions as to who might be behind it. I think at this point, no outsider, meaning that nobody outside the intelligence security services has any idea what's going on. And if they say they do, they're lying. Even those who are inside are speaking about one of the most complex investigations in the history of this country to find out who was behind this. Some people mention that the double strike, the two bombs that go off almost simultaneously, is an Al-Qaeda trademark. Yes and no. It depends which part of the world you're talking about. I would definitely caution very much against linking this to Al-Qaeda necessarily. Al-Qaeda is known for ambitious operations. This particular operation strikes me as pretty crude, pretty rudimentary. Obviously, any life is a loss and a horrendous crime. However, it doesn't strike me as the kind of thing that Al-Qaeda would want to do, because it doesn't look as impressive as previous things have done, particularly, of course, 9/11. And this may sound somewhat cynical and controversial, but I mean, the bombing has already happened, unfortunately. There's nothing we can do to change that. I think for American counterterrorism officials, the best possible outcome at this point is that this was, in fact, an Al-Qaeda operation.
Now, that's kind of a controversial thing to say, as you mentioned, because why would that be a good thing for this to have been perpetrated by someone outside our country, someone who was attacking us? How would that be a good thing?
This was an improvised explosive device, an IED. It was planted in the middle of a big crowd. Those things go off, by the way, in Iraq and Afghanistan every other day, with dozens of casualties, dozens of dead people. 50, 60, 70 is not unheard of. If you compare this particular strike with what happened, say, in Iraq and Afghanistan, this is small stuff. I would argue that if, after all of its heated rhetoric about destroying the infidels and that kind of stuff, this is the best Al-Qaeda can do. Set up, a small device in the Boston Marathon, and kill 2 or 3 people, then that means for sure that this organization is on its way out. And that's why I said that I think that for counterterrorism officials, this would be like a positive scenario. It definitely shows a degree of deterioration of Al-Qaeda's operational abilities.
You're listening to WETS Community Forum on WETS FM and HD1. I'm Wayne Winkler, and I'm talking with Joseph Fitsanakis, the coordinator of the Security and Intelligence Studies program at King University in Bristol. Joseph, you said that the best outcome for United States security services would be if this were an Al-Qaeda operation that took place this past week in Boston. What would be the worst case?
In my personal view, the worst case scenario would be that if this was a domestic group associated with the far right. Let me remind you that the last time that an American athletic event was targeted was the 96 Atlanta Centennial Olympic bombings, who were organized by Eric Robert Rudolph, who was actually a far-right anti-abortion and anti-gay activist. So we do have a precedent for that. If that turns out to be a domestic far-right group, which I hope it will not be, if that's the case, though, it will definitely seem to confirm many of our worst fears about the unprecedented rise of far-right groups in the United States today.
Well, in a case like that, it could be an individual like Eric Rudolph, who pulled off the Atlantic Olympics bombing, among other things. In your view, would it be better or worse if this turned out to be the work of an individual rather than a group?
That's a great question. I think you're referring to what we call lone wolf terrorism,
right,
which is the hardest terrorism to fight against. Because you think about this, people call this recent strike in Boston as an intelligence failure, refer to it as an intelligence failure. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. Intelligence, the way it works is you try to penetrate an organized militant group or a terrorist group, and you do that by penetrating the points of contact, the points of communication between the different members of the group. If there are no members in the group, just one person, there are no points of contact. Therefore, it's almost impossible for an intelligence agency to penetrate that. And that becomes a law enforcement operation. The burden then gets carried by the police force that was there in Boston and was supposed to protect the visitors and the audience and the competitors. So if it's a lone wolf terrorism, then as the case in Atlanta, then that would not be as serious as if this were an organized group of the type, for example, of Timothy McVeigh's bombing of the Oklahoma Federal Building in 95. That would be far more dangerous because it would show a level of organization and operational coherence between members of far-right groups, which, as recent research shows, they are now beginning to merge. And by that I mean it used to be the case, say, 10, 12 years ago, that you would rarely see a neo-Nazi hanging out with a KKK member. They would represent different spectrums of the population, different areas, rural versus urban, and so on and so forth. So these lines of separation are beginning to blur, and we're seeing a lot more cooperation between what used to be disparate groups. And if that is, in fact, confirmed as a far-right group, then that is worrying, very worrying.
You're listening to WETS Community Forum. I'm Wayne Winkler, and I'm talking with Joseph Fitsanakis, the coordinator of the Security and Intelligence Studies program at King University in Bristol, Tennessee. And we're talking about the events of this past week in Boston, the bombing at the Boston Marathon. When we talked, it was Wednesday evening, and no suspects had been named or apprehended. As I'm speaking now, putting this program together, it is Friday afternoon. One suspect was killed early this morning. One is still at large as of noon on Friday. Of course, things have certainly developed over the weekend, and we know more now than we do as I'm speaking. But we'll continue this conversation with Joseph Fitsanakis, and I want to ask, what is the purpose of terrorism? What do terrorists hope to achieve by their acts?
Terrorism tries to change political attitudes by circumventing organized military structures, trying to get the people to pressure their government to change the way they do things. So, for instance, in the United States, as we all know, America has the biggest, most humongous military history has ever seen. And so any foreign adversary knows very well that if they were to face America's military head-on, the only possible outcome is they're going to lose. So the whole principle behind this is you have to circumvent this military and strike behind enemy lines as soft targets. That's what terrorism is all about. Now, having said this, I want to caution people about this kind of stereotypical view of terrorist threats or security threats. We seem to always focus on these kind of groups that prefer explosives, or they want to go cause a big bang of the type that we saw in 9/11. I think if you talk to serious counterterrorism officials, they will caution you away from these types of obsession with kind of groups like Al-Qaeda to something that's much more dangerous. I would actually argue that a much bigger threat for the United States is not the guys with the bombs or the AK-47s. A bigger threat for the United States would be perhaps, for instance, a bioterrorist attack on the United States using some kind of virus that, again, debilitates your military, because your military, you cannot shoot at a virus. And because of our healthcare system in America, which bars so many people from access to healthcare, a bioterrorist attack on the United States would be very damaging. Because think about this, the average American citizen, 1/3 of us has no access to health care. Even those who do would rather not go because it costs too much. So once you start coming down with Ebola, let's say, and you start experiencing the first symptoms of Ebola, you don't want to go to the doctor because you don't want to pay for it.
Right, you put it off as long as you can.
Absolutely. I would do the same thing, right? Mm-hmm. You think you can get over it and somehow, but by the time you just realize this is serious, Ebola's already taken over your body, and you probably have already spread it. Okay, and that's why, you should even see our healthcare system as a national security issue. People talk about the politicization of this. I see it as a national security issue. What is the point of funding our military through the roof when in issues like this, that can become basically the Achilles heel of the United States, we don't even consider that as a possible threat? Another case that I'd like to mention, since we're talking about security, if you think about this in the kind of the long run, and if you talk to officials in the Pentagon and in Washington, the biggest threat to America's security today is not Al-Qaeda. The biggest security threat today is climate change, global warming, which 99.7% of all scientists who publish on this field say it's happening. And it's going to have dramatic effects, not just on the American economy, but the world economy. We're talking about the desertification of entire parts of our country and entire parts of Central America. Even if that's a remote possibility, which it isn't, this is happening already. If it's a remote possibility, the security implications of this for the United States are absolutely massive. And because of our obsession with the people with the guns and the bombs, we don't see this as a security threat, which I think we should. And in fact, those who know, those insiders in Washington, already are seeing that. It's just that our media and our overall population does not see it.
And that's a scenario that could render Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups pretty much irrelevant overnight. You're listening to WETS Community Forum. I'm Wayne Winkler, and I'm talking with Joseph Fitsanakis, the coordinator of the Security and Intelligence Studies program at King University in Bristol, Tennessee. We're talking about the bombing this past week in Boston and talking about terrorism in general. Now, you've been talking about a group like Al-Qaeda who has very big plans. They want to either destroy the United States and the West and bring it under their own control or their own beliefs. But you also have terrorist groups with more limited ambitions, and I'm thinking of the Irish Republican Army that wasn't out to destroy England. They just wanted certain things from England.
Yeah, I think it's important not to confuse or not to blend in all of these groups that are very, very different, that have different goals. What makes Al-Qaeda stand out, and I think correctly in my mind, is that it does have global aims. Al-Qaeda, basically what it wants to do is create an Islamic caliphate, a kingdom, ruled under Islamic law, Sharia, which encompasses all of the traditional Muslim areas of the world, beginning from southern Spain and reaching all the way to Indonesia and everything in between. So now compare them to a group, say, like the Taliban. The Taliban are a local militant group. They don't have global aspirations. The Taliban are basically representative of one specific ethnic group in Afghanistan, the Pashtuns. And what they want is to have their own country or their own territory to rule by themselves. They don't believe in the government in Kabul, and they don't particularly care for it, and they just want to be united in one country. Some of them live in Afghanistan, some of them live in Pakistan. That's the gift that we received or we inherited from the British Empire. And when the Taliban began fighting the Afghan government, they had no problem with the United States. In fact, they didn't even know that we existed. The average Pashtun villager or peasant doesn't even know Kabul exists, okay, let alone New York. And so when America went into Afghanistan to fight ostensibly bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, the enemy wasn't necessarily the Taliban. The Taliban happened to be hosting those who attacked us on 9/11. In fact, there have been studies done today by ACOS, which is a survey group in Afghanistan, and they have found that over 90% of the Afghan peasants or people, rural people, don't know 9/11 ever happened. Okay, we keep talking about living in the Stone Age. I mean, that is actually true. They have no radio or television. Most cannot read or write. And when you show them images of the burning towers, they have no clue what you're talking about. And so the reason for that is, of course, because we never bothered to tell them why we're there. Mm-hmm. Right? So you go there and they're seeing all of a sudden the Taliban, who have no global goals, right? They have territorial, strictly local goals, as you mentioned before. In the case of the IRA, it's very similar, for instance. It's a nationalist group, ethno-nationalist group. And we go there and they see these foreign American troops, and they have no idea who we are, why we're there. And the Al-Qaeda, of course, uses that as a great propaganda tool. They say they come here to take your country, take your religion, and take your women. And the effect of this was, of course, a closer alliance between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in years after 2001. So by going in those places without an understanding of the very different nature of all of these groups, you end up often making the problem worse instead of better. It's all in the detail. The importance of understanding the global surge of terrorism is all about understanding the small print. If you don't do that, you're likely to make tragic mistakes.
I'm Wayne Winkler, and I'm talking with Dr. Joseph Fitsanakis on WETS Community Forum. He's the coordinator of the Security and Intelligence Studies program at King University in Bristol. His work has been referenced in hundreds of outlets around the world, including the New York Times, the BBC, the Boston Herald, Washington Post, Al Jazeera, and many others. He's also the senior editor of Intel News and a regular contributor to specialized publications. Are there examples of nations or governments that have dealt with terrorism effectively, that have used an enlightened approach, let's say, and been effective in putting down terrorist activity?
The two cases that I come to mind immediately are the one of the Chechens, the Chechnya War, the first and second that happened in post-Soviet Russia in the 1990s. And the response of the Russian government was, of course, to go in there and flatten the place out. We're talking about Grozny, the capital of Chechnya. It's the first time in history, I think, where the capital of a federal republic was flattened by its own military, by the same country's military. And of course, the reason the war ended is because there was nothing left to fight over. Chechnya now is basically just flattened. It reminds you of Dresden, in 1945. But you have the example of the IRA, the provisional IRA in the United Kingdom, who were fighting, again, a nationalist group fighting for independence, fighting for secession and unification with Ireland. But the Tony Blair government, with the assistance of the Clinton administration, handled it completely differently. They understood that the problems there were to do with economic issues, issues of disenfranchisement. The Irish Catholics felt they didn't have any stake in the way the country was run. And they basically finally decided to meet with them and talk with them, and there was this kind of merging of all the actors, the British government, the Irish government, and the provisional IRA, who decided to basically solve the problems politically. And it's not perfect, of course. Some people from both sides of the community, Protestants and Catholics, are still believing that they need to resort to weapons, to arms. But you can't even compare the two cases. We're talking about the complete destruction of our entire people, the Chechens, versus basically the kind of truce and realignment of the IRA with traditional democratic norms. There's the two options that I think any politician facing militant groups is faced with today.
What are the wrong reactions to terrorism? How do countries get it wrong? For example, after 9/11, here in the United States, airline travel became kind of problematic. You couldn't bring shampoo. You had to take your shoes off, those sorts of things. Were we doing the right thing, or was this just some sort of a gut reaction that didn't really have any kind of effect toward making us safer?
It seems to me that a lot of these TSA-type precautions are more of a mind game, a psychological game to make us feel better. Of course, terrorism experts will tell you this, that, if you're determined to take some kind of weapon on a plane, there's ways around it. People smuggle all kinds of stuff, planes, like drugs and all kinds of things, even like rare animals sometimes. And, all you have to do to realize that this is not for real is to travel to Israel, and travel to Israel, whenever you fly in and out of Israel, you have to go there at least 3 hours before your flight because of the numbers of interviews you have to go through. They take apart all your luggage. That's serious. But interestingly, they never take away your water. They don't care about that. So if the Israelis, who have to face this kind of thing on a daily basis, don't care about the water, it makes you wonder what exactly we're doing here. In fact, I've seen an interview with a former head of Israeli airline security who said once that what TSA are doing in America today is what Israel was doing 50 years ago. Kind of moved on from that. And that kind of gives you, it puts it in perspective, of what exactly is going on here. But on top of this, I think that in talking about particularly airline security is one small aspect of transportation security. And a lot of experts have cautioned against, focusing too much on one area. And you're kind of obsessed with airline security because that's what was used as a weapon in 9/11. What about train security? What about bus security? What about the harbors of America, where we bring in tons and tons of imported goods for sale from all over the world, and about 1/10 of that ever gets inspected because we don't have enough money to inspect every single shipment. What if something comes in through those types of avenues? So my point here, I guess, would be that if our goal is to make our country as secure as humanly possible, we can go that route, but we can forget about democracy in the process, because you cannot do both.
I'm Wayne Winkler, and I'm talking with Joseph Fitsanakis of King University in Bristol, Tennessee. He coordinates the Security and Intelligence Studies program. We've been talking about the events in Boston of this past week and about terrorism in general. And I should reiterate a point that was made earlier in this program, that we don't know if the events in Boston actually qualify as terrorism or not. We might suspect, based on what we know this weekend, but we don't really know the purpose behind the explosions, so we don't know if it actually qualifies as terrorism under the definition that Dr. Fitsanakis gave us earlier. Do you have any other thoughts on terrorism, and particularly on the American response to terrorism?
In relation to airline security, we seem to have this kind of weird view of terrorism as something that's coming from abroad. And I think that by focusing on, like, how do we stop those foreigners from coming in, it's not going to do it. People forget this. The most prolific, violent, and powerful terrorist group in American history has been the Ku Klux Klan. There's nothing foreign about that.
Right.
There is nothing foreign about the Ku Klux Klan. In addition to this, we seem to have this idea that somehow terrorists, want to come to America to target us on our home soil. That is not always the case. In fact, we have a lot of case studies now of American-born Islamic fanatics who travel abroad to fight the jihad, the holy war, against Americans in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. This view of America as the holy grail of terrorist targets, I think we should be very careful about this. We have a lot of precautions, ostensibly, of how to stop foreigners from coming in. What about stopping Americans from going to somewhere like Iraq, joining the holy war there, and fighting American troops there? We have no precautions against it. So I think our entire counterterrorism policy is designed on stereotypes. And we let our emotions direct our counterterrorism policy instead of looking at the data, and the data points to other directions.
Joseph Fitsanakis is the coordinator of the Security and Intelligence Studies program at King University in Bristol, Tennessee. He's the author of several books and articles on the history and politics of intelligence and international espionage, and his work has been referenced in hundreds of outlets around the world. He's also the senior editor of Intel News and a regular contributor to many specialized publications. I'm Wayne Winkler, and this has been WETS Community Forum.
This is NPR.